Let's go to Washington. Let's bring in Jennifer Gavito, Senior Advisor to the Cohen Group, strategic advisory body. And before that, a long-standing US diplomat, including Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, which included Iran in the government of President Biden. Welcome to France 24, Jennifer. Let's begin. President Trump says he's doing what no president before dared him to do. He'll stop, he said today, when he feels it in his bones. And critics might say that is not a strategy, but on saying he's daring to do something that presidents like President Biden didn't do. Is he right?
Certainly, this option has been on the table, and I should say first, thanks for having me on today. He's right that this option has certainly been on the table and, in fact, urged by Israel for more than 20 years. And it is true that no other president has done this, but I would argue that that was with good reason. When we considered in the last administration what to do about the very difficult challenge of a brutal regime in Iran, we looked at all of the factors that we see playing out today. Potential for closing of the Strait of Hormuz, potential for further crackdowns on civilians in Iran, the cost to the global economy, and most importantly, real question about what you can achieve militarily. And so I would say, yes, it's true. Nobody else did this, but arguably, I think we're seeing why.
I think you spoke back in January, Jennifer, about you called it a Pandora's box being opened by targeting Iran with strikes. Is this how you saw it playing out?
Unfortunately, it is. Again, for many years now, across successive U.S. administrations, both Democrat and Republican, the experts whose job it is to look at these very difficult issues have warned that if you attempted to undertake regime change, and I think we need to be clear that at least going into the conflict, that is in fact what the attempt seemed to be. If you attempt regime change, then the likely outcome was going to be potentially further consolidation of power by the IRGC, resulting in a more ideological, more hard-lined Iranian regime that represents a greater, not lesser threat. And so, yes, you've seen all of the things that I think would fall into the Pandora's box explanation, which is exactly that scenario, alongside rising energy prices, rising fertilizer prices, disruptions to global trade, and potentially greater instability, not just in Iran, but throughout the Middle East.
I think I'm right in saying, Jen, that you've ward gamed this in the past, that it turned into chaos. And I would imagine at the time you probably advised President Biden what you've just told me. But I want to also mention, though, Doug Farrar was on this program recently, just before the capture of the Venezuelan then President Nicolas Maduro. The American analyst Doug Farrar said this. He said, we war gamed this since 2019 about the possible capture, or he said the assassination of Maduro. He said every war game since then ended in chaos, but it hasn't. So is there a point that he's making that you can engineer something that's not always in the playbook?
So you can, absolutely. And I think one of the hallmarks of the Trump administration's foreign policy, both this time and in the previous administration, has been to kind of disrupt a lot of the long-held assumptions. And I would argue that in some cases that has actually resulted in far less problematic outcomes than maybe the foreign policy establishment had envisioned. And here I'm thinking about moving the U.S. Embassy, for example, to Jerusalem, or moving ahead with the Abraham Accords without a deal with the Palestinians. So first, I think that maybe sometimes the impacts are not always felt in the short term. By moving forward without the Palestinians, I do think that there may be direct linkages to October 7th and the war that ensued after. Just a feeling amongst Palestinians that there was no horizon for them politically to have their own state. So all those impacts aren't always felt in the short term. But to your question, absolutely, war games are just that. They're not a guarantee. They're how the experts view the likely scenarios. In the case of Venezuela, though, I think it would be difficult to make a parallel argument there. Venezuela was very much governed by one man and one man's regime. And so essentially you removed one piece of that, but Delcy Rodriguez remains in place. If you tried to do that in Iran, and there's plenty of reporting, including again today, that that was what President Trump had in mind. First, if you remove, as you have now done, the key leadership, there are many levels below that that, as I just noted, are even more ideological than he was. It must be said that the previous supreme leader actually never pursued a nuclear weapon, nuclear technology for sure, but not a nuclear weapon. And so now you're facing a more potentially hardline ideological regime. Second, this is not Venezuela. This is not Libya. This is not Syria. The structures of power in Iran, for as disruptive and brutal as they are functioning. There's a constitution. There is a legislature. There's a judiciary, and so it's not as easy as it may have been in Venezuela just to remove a personality and expect complicity with the United States from there.
We heard a little bit from Peter Hegseth a moment ago, Jennifer. I just want to listen to this as well. So he was talking about how this war should be framed and said the media's got it wrong. It shouldn't be focusing what he said was a widening war. He'd seen the headlines. He said the story is the crumbling of the regime. This is what he said.
Yet some in this crew, in the press, just can't stop. Allow me to make a few suggestions. People look up at the TV and they see banners, they see headlines. I used to be in that business, and I know that everything is written intentionally. For example, a banner or a headline, Mideast war intensifies, splashing on the screen the last couple of days, alongside visuals of civilian or energy targets that Iran has hit, because that's what they do. What should the banner read instead? How about Iran increasingly desperate? Because they are. They know it, and so do you, if it can be admitted.
There is real confidence there, Jen, in what he sees as a vision. And we listen to people like Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, saying that Washington knows what it's doing. And yet there seems to be a divide. There are others. I want to quote the author Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great. He defined what he called the hubris trap, a critical point whereby successful leaders become overconfident after early wins, causing them to make strategically disastrous decisions. Success in mind, capturing Maduro, success in Operation Midnight Hammer. So there is this divide, isn't there? Washington knows what it's doing, and others say he's caught in a hubris trap.
I don't know that I agree that Washington knows what it's doing in this case. And the reason that I question that is because they haven't been able to articulate it. We have heard every possible justification for this operation, ranging from destruction of the nuclear program to destruction of the missile program, to degrading the drone program, to protecting Iranian civilians, to regime change and total surrender. And so, it's possible that you can meet certain aspects of that. And I think that there is a world in which, although the costs certainly are rising, but there's a world in which the Trump administration could point to some of the military operational successes that it has had in these first 14 days, and say that they have succeeded in what they set out to do. The missile program has been degraded. The stockpiles of both missiles and drones seem to have fallen precipitously. I don't think we've seen much action yet against the nuclear program, but of course, President Trump famously said that had been obliterated back in the summer. But you could point to operational successes. If your objective, which we still don't know, is regime change, certainly that is not underway. And the way that this campaign has been undertaken is much different than the 12-day war. And so you certainly last summer had military success. This time, I think that you, by taking out the leadership of Iran, have set into motion, going back to the Pandora's box, you've set into motion things that you don't quite predict. And so if Iran hangs on to its enriched uranium, and you have a new regime that is more determined to weaponize its nuclear technology, I would argue you're not in a safer place than you were, and that maybe you didn't entirely know what you were doing when you set out, and certainly when you took out the leadership and executed the campaign this way. But again, we don't know yet, because we don't know what the end point is. We don't know what the objective is, and so it's just very hard to answer that question.
Another question which still hasn't been answered, and I wonder if you've been looking at this as well. Go back to day one of the conflict, the northern city of Majid, the killing of more than 160 people, including 110 children, the majority between 7 and 12 years old. The UN saying attacks on students and schools are amongst the gravest breaches of international law. Still questions about what happened. The US says it appears, according to preliminary reports in the US press, to be an intelligence failure. But we're told from the president and from the war secretary, it's still investigating. Is this unusual, an investigation this long?
So I'm not familiar with the details of the investigation, and so I'm not in a position to definitively say that. But I would note that it does seem clear that the strike came from the United States. It seems plausible that it was an intelligence failure. There were legitimate targets in the area, albeit not there. What I think is unusual, though, is I think is maybe you're trying to get at the unwillingness of the administration to take ownership of what was a tragic mistake. And tragedies happen in conflict. That has always been true. But if the United States was responsible, as it seems to be, in the deaths of all of these girls, and in recognition of the grief that their families are feeling. Normally, you would expect the administration to go out and discuss that. And I saw a comparison to a similar event in Afghanistan a decade ago, in which 2 days after the event, the CENTCOM commander was out talking about what had happened, taking responsibility for it. And the next day was in front of Congress, answering questions about how such a miscalculation could have been made. That's what one would expect from a military like ours, that again is invariably going to make mistakes, but has historically assumed ownership for that and sought to learn and ensure that it doesn't happen again.
Can we talk about Russia? Is this a win for Putin right now? We have the Straits of Hormuz effectively at a standstill. Gulf states shooting down drones, some getting through, the death toll creeping up, tourists scared to be in the Gulf. And here in Europe, and I'm sure where you are in the US, petrol prices spiking. The answer to that, for some relief, appears to be, for President Trump, a temporary relief so that there aren't sanctions on companies and countries taking Russian oil at sea, which is estimated to be 125 million barrels, maybe lasting 4 to 5 days.
Yes, I mean, I don't think this could be described as anything other than a huge win for Vladimir Putin, and specifically for his campaign of aggression against Ukraine. The idea that in order to alleviate energy prices, you allow Russia to refill its war chest, I think is unthinkable. And yet that seems to be exactly what is happening here. So, I mean, I think, you referred previously to the NATO SecGen Ruta's comments of seeming solidarity with the United States, but we're hearing the comments out of Italy, out of the UK, out of France, and elsewhere about this conflict. And I think, first of all, Putin was already relishing the seeming division between NATO allies over the U.S. action here. And to add to that now, Putin's ability to, again, finance his war in Ukraine more effectively through the sale of sanctioned oil, I think must deeply, deeply concern our European allies.
Well, as you say that, just worth noting Friedrich Merz's comments today, the German Chancellor, who says, to your points, Jennifer, basically that he's asking for questions and answers from the US as to why the sanctions relief have gone ahead, why now. We believe this is the wrong course of action. He also asked for questions as to how the war is going to be ended. And it speaks of somebody who's certainly was a strong friend of the US and who's now asking big questions of Washington. I also want to get your thoughts before you go tonight, Jennifer. It's very interesting to note something we don't always cover, but is probably going to play a huge role in shaping the wars to follow: artificial intelligence. the Pentagon making clear in the past week or so it wants to use tech giants' technologies as it sees fit within legal means, it says. But Anthropic and this AI bot Claude in the capture of Maduro in Venezuela, it's said to be used. It's now basically having refused its use of AI for mass surveillance in the US and for developing autonomous weapons. It's been cast out for it, in fact, classed as a supply chain risk. Now, what have we seen this week? Very interesting. Anthropic is the most downloaded app, overtaking ChatGPT. Does this indicate to you that even in or despite war, the public demand is for ethical AI?
Yes, I mean, I think certainly it reflects ongoing public skepticism or uncertainty, maybe is a better word, about future uses of AI. There's been interesting polling over the last couple of years, demonstrating that while clearly an invaluable tool in a lot of ways, the public generally, and I don't think this is limited to the United States, the public generally has skepticism and concerns about the way that AI could be deployed. And so there remains an important conversation to be had. And again, setting aside, the current conflict, there remains an important conversation about how you regulate that, how you regulate it, going back to Europe, how you regulate it in coordination with allies, to make sure that the best of AI can be utilized, but that sufficient checks are on it to ensure that that doesn't become dangerous. So I think exactly as you say, particularly given the heightened concerns as we find ourselves now in a moment of war, I think it's reflective of a public that would like answers to those questions before they buy into those technologies wholesale.
Jennifer, really interesting to talk to you tonight. Thank you for your time. Jennifer Gavito, thank you. Senior advisor to the Cohen Group, Strategic Advisory Group. Before that, as I said, a long-standing US diplomat.